Okay, so the devil is always envious of man and will do anything to block our spiritual work. This is why it's important to have a spiritual father to help you identify these things. So St. Isaac the Syrian says, "No one has ascended into heaven effortlessly." No one has ascended into heaven effortlessly. By the way, a lot of monastics say, and church fathers have said, if all the writings of the church fathers were to disappear and all we had left were St. Isaac the Syrian's writings, we would be in good shape. Because St. Isaac has such a great spiritual insight. He was a monastic. But he says, no one has ascended into heaven effortlessly. So in Romans, St. Paul says, the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed to us. So in this world, because of the fallen state of the world that we're living in, we have to kind of earn back our salvation. But again, it's not that we're earning it. It's not that we are saving ourselves. Christ did the saving. But we have to accept it through works. The Protestants have a very hard time with this, but this is very scriptural, actually. Jesus Christ himself said that he was going to separate the sheep from the goats, meaning the people who did good from the people who did not do good. And he specifically defines those things as feeding the hungry and clothing the naked and visiting the sick and in prison. If you don't do those things, he's going to call us a wicked and lazy servant, and he's going to put us on his left with the goats, and we are going to go into the eternal fire which he prepared for the devil and his angels. Those are Jesus' words. St. James, the brother of the Lord, says in his universal epistle, faith without works is dead. So you tell me, are works necessary for our salvation? The church has always taught yes. Yes, Jesus Christ did all the work himself, but we can't understand salvation like a light switch. It's like, you accepted Jesus as your Savior, click, you're going to heaven. No, there's an asceticism, and there's the more you put into it, and heaven I don't think is going to be as cut and dry as you go to heaven or you don't go to heaven. A lot of monastics say, if only I can be the least in the kingdom of heaven. What's that mean? It means there's going to be a first. Who's the first in the kingdom of heaven after God? The Virgin Mary, and then John the Baptist, and then different ranks of saints. So, yes, being last in the kingdom of heaven, would be happy to do that. But the more ascetical practices we have on earth, the more we've denied the world and our bodily pleasures, the closer we will be to God. So, ascesis is not only the abstinence from sensual pleasures and thoughts enslaved to the passions. This is only the first stage. So this, the author of the book calls it the negative aspect. So on page 186, he says, Christians' ascesis is a life-quickening deadness, and its final purpose is for man to become a vessel of the Holy Spirit and to begin to live in Christ. That is, in its positive aspect. So, again, the negative aspect is to deny ourselves from our bodily pleasures, sensual pleasures. If the ascetic struggle is to bear fruit, man must fully renounce earthly pleasures and even hold life itself in contempt. Christ says, whoever comes to me and does not hate even life itself cannot be my disciple. That's on page 186 in your book. It's Luke 14:26. You can cross-reference Luke 14, 17, and 33. In order for the ascetical life to begin, there must be a longing for God. The person must see God as incomparably higher and greater than anything else. So that makes sense. If you think of God as incomparably better than anything else, it's easy to leave everything else to go to him. If you don't realize God's greatness, then we get caught up in earthly pleasures. Ascesis requires great efforts in the beginning, but once the person has a taste of the glory of God, even the most difficult ascetical practices pale in comparison to the joy which one receives from God. Excuse me. So, again, at the beginning, it's very hard. When somebody first becomes a monk, there's kind of like a honeymoon period where everything's beautiful and all that. Then they go through like a really difficult spiritual struggle, and then they start to feel the benefits of that spiritual struggle, and then they actually look to increase their spiritual struggle little by little because they want to receive more of a blessing. And that's why you have certain kinds of ascetics or monastics who did things like they lived on pillars. They went up and lived on a pillar, and that was like one of the most extreme forms of asceticism. So extreme that at the time, people in the church thought that maybe it was demonic because they didn't understand it. But then they prayed about it, and they realized how holy those people were. Or being a hermit, living completely on one's own. So they ask for these increased struggles so that they can receive even greater joy. There are some monastics who, if they're not sick for a while, they pray to God, crying to Him, saying, "Why have you forgotten me? Please give me some illness so that I can become closer to you." All right, and that's a true understanding of the glory of God.
You think so?
Yes. It sounds like maybe like we're beating ourselves up or flogging ourselves or something like that. And that's not what the church teaches. We don't like harm our bodies or hurt ourselves. And these more extreme cases of monasticism, we can't even understand them. That's why you have a hard time even hearing about it.
Oh, I know people do that, but I don't agree with them. I feel like it's too much.
Okay.
God wants us to be more simple. That's my belief. I
Well,
feel like there's too much extremist.
Well, so like the saints, like Saint Simeon the Stylite, right? What did he do? He lived up on a pillar. And if you hear his story, he could do things that many other people couldn't do. Where did these gifts come from? From God because of his asceticism. Now, again, these extreme forms are not for everybody. Even monasticism, which we're about to talk about, is not for everybody. These are very difficult practices. All we have to do is the practice that our spiritual father gives us.
I thought that the people in the monastery were ascetic.
They are ascetic.
They're living an ascetic life. That's how people say it, right?
That's correct. And we're about to talk about monasticism now, but there are different levels even within the monastic. There are different monasteries that you can go to that you'll see different levels.
You can be living an ascetic life and not be a monk.
Yes. So we're all called to live ascetic lives to a certain extent, but there's a way to live an ascetic life with your wife or husband, right? That's it's not complete chastity like the monks and nuns do, but there is a purity even within the marriage relationship. Okay, so we're all called to be ascetical in one way or another. Remember, Adam and Eve's ascetical struggle, or Adam's at least, was to till and keep the grounds of paradise. And when he failed at that, we had to be given more things and harder things. And we had sickness and death and all these other things to deal with. So the forms of monasticism that I was just talking about, like being a hermit or a stylite, that means living up on the pillar, those are very special kinds that you have to have a special blessing. Even as a monastic, you can't just go do it on your own. You have to have a blessing from your spiritual father, and they don't give them very easily. There are many monks who they say, "Can I go be a hermit?" And the spiritual father says, "No, it's not for you, and it's not the time for that." And even hermits sometimes have to leave the hermit lifestyle and go back to the monastery. So there's, excuse me, there's different levels of asceticism. So what's our job in asceticism as people? I mean, I'm not a layperson, but I'm not a monastic either, right? So what's our job? Your job is to be obedient to your parish priest. But as we're about to talk now about obedience, your obedience is not going to be the same as a monastic's obedience. It can't be, because you're not living in that kind of a lifestyle, and I'm not trained to give that kind of an obedience to people. So we'll talk about monastic obedience for a little bit, and then we could talk more about our kind of asceticism. But just to give you an idea, your prayer rule is your ascetical practice. Your fasting, your almsgiving, your chastity, even within marriage, there are times to be chaste. All these things are part of your ascetical struggle. You're putting up with difficult situations. That's an ascetical struggle, how you deal with that. It can be, or else you can fail the challenge. But there are all these kinds of ascetical struggles. Remember last week we even talked about kind of menial tasks like sweeping the floor and washing dishes and things like that. It can be a kind of ascetical practice. And that's what the monastics do during their monasticism. They do a lot of tasks like that so that they can practice their prayer and use it as a way to serve their brothers or sisters. So any questions on what we did so far before I get into monasticism? Yes, John?
One of the things I've always questioned in my heart and mind is like, you mentioned almsgiving and sacramental life and all these things we need to do to be obedient to the church and our parish father. But then the scriptures tell us to visit the poor and feed the hungry and visit those in prison. It seems like that would be within the sacramental life of the church. It seems like so. Do I do what the scriptures telling me to do? I mean, I've never once fed a hungry person other than to give my money to organizations that have.
But that's how we feed the hungry these days. So is it bad? Excuse me. Is it bad to go and give a sandwich to a homeless person? No, that's a beautiful thing. But in the old days, people didn't give money. Even to the church, they didn't give money. What did they give to the church? Or
their produce.
Their produce, right?
Farming.
Even until maybe a generation or two ago in the Middle East or in Greece, what did they give the priest? They give him eggs, or they give him a chicken, or they give him whatever. Olive oil, right? So that's how you used to feed the priest, right? That's also how you would feed a homeless person in those days, by giving them, because you didn't really have money. Money was like, you might sell a few of your eggs, but you might also trade them for other things. So money was, less something you had. You might have a little bit, but it was more in trade for things.
Still to this day,
Yeah, so that's how people used to literally feed a person. But by giving money to, let's say, our Man Meal program, aren't you feeding the hungry?
theoretically.
Well, you are. I mean, because the money is going directly to them.
He's personally not feeding them, then, is what he's getting.
No, he is, because I'll tell you why. While he's at work, he's making money and he's giving a portion of his time at work, because how is our time measured? By how much money we make, right? So however much he gives, and that's why the church teaches us to give a tithe, because 1/10 of your time should go to God. So even that's a tenth of your time at work, that's how you spend it with God, is by giving a tithe. So you give your money to the church, for example, earmark it, manna meal or whatever, and that money will go to feed the poor. And so you are feeding the poor because of your ascetic labor. Your ascetic labor could even be at work. Does that make sense?
It makes very much sense, and to contribute to that, there's a part of me that understands that and hears that and wants to be obedient to that, but then there's another part of me that says, do I really want to risk that? So when I pass and my soul is separated from my body and the Lord is judging my life, and he says to me, well, John, you didn't feed anybody. It seems to me, or you didn't go to the prisons, or you didn't go see a widow, but I gave to those organizations. Do I really want to roll those dice like that?
Well,
do I want to gamble like that?
Yeah, so that's why you're obedient to a spiritual father, because then it's on me. And actually, I've put in place where they haven't met yet, but I've put in place a charity committee, so to increase the amount that we can do for the community, for those who need it. So I've put together a visitation ministry that we just finally this week are getting people who want to be visited. And so I have some people working on assigning visitors to those people. We're putting together the charity committee, to study which organizations to give to, so that we're not giving to an organization who may feed the poor but also support abortion. right? So we have to be very specific about who we're giving to. So I set up a committee to do that and to work out all the legal necessities of giving correctly. In our current day and age, the danger with giving to the poor is you don't know what you're contributing to. So if you give a homeless man $10, what's he using that money for?
That's why you give them actual food.
Well, yeah.
You give them actual food or say, here, I'll take you and buy you a hamburger, or come have lunch and we'll
Yeah.
sit down.
And if you can do that, that's great.
Bring them holy bread, and then that'll matter.
I know a lot of people that I've asked, who have asked for handouts, and I've asked them, can I get you a sandwich or something? A lot of times they say no.
Right.
And maybe they're not hungry at that time. But also, maybe then they can save that money that they would have used on food to buy alcohol or something. And what we have, like in Charleston, is we have organizations that keep track of who's getting what so that they can make sure that they're using their resources to the best of their ability. Now, is that a perfect system? No, it's not. Could they use more? Probably. Could we do more? Our church is looking into that right now, looking into a way to do more to help clothe the naked and feed the homeless. And I think we should do a better job than just doing it at Christmas time, right? Because people are cold all year round. They're hungry all year round. So we're looking into those kind of things. But we need people also who want to go out and visit the sick and in prison, right? And so that's why we're setting up these things. Prison ministry, though, it's very difficult. It's a long process. You have to go through training. You have to go through screening. Just to go to the prison, it might take you hours before you even get in to see the inmates that you're there to see, or you might get there and wait for an hour, and then they tell you they can't meet with you today. So it's not an easy process. And people work. They don't have all day to work on these things. So again, that's why we come to our spiritual father. If you feel like you're not doing enough, believe me, I'll find you something to do. Yes, Ian.
Is it really our fault if we give to somebody who is on the street and asking for money, what they do with the money? Is it really our sin at that point for giving them, like whenever the intention is good of trying to feed the hungry and feeding the people who are in need? Is it really is it really on us if that person chooses to take that money and instead of feeding themselves or something like that, and say going and doing something that's more unscrupulous?
How would you know unless they admit it, unless they blatantly say,
Yeah.
well, here, I'm about
So-
to do that.
So the disciples say in the book called the Didache that we are responsible for the money that we give, what happens with it. And that's the basis for that I always tell people not to just give. By the way, there are a lot of the people who stand up, you see the same person or same like rotation of people on the same street corner. That's a scheme. In certain cities, they'll have like a baby with them. They put the baby on drugs to keep the baby quiet and sick looking to get more money. All that money goes to one person, and then they keep those people happy by feeding them with their drug habit, right? There's a famous homeless lady in Lebanon who for years and years and years,
She has millions in there.
yeah, she would stand and beg for money. When the banks were closing before one of the wars, she ran to the bank to get all her millions of dollars out. If you think about it, and I always see, every time I'm passing by, I always see somebody giving the people money. How much is minimum wage if you work?
$8.75.
Yeah, I imagine one person could give them $10, and that's just as I was watching them pass by. I think you make way more money begging than you do working a minimum wage job, right? So that becomes their job. And that's maybe a failure of our system. But I think our money does go to, when it goes to something bad, we are kind of responsible for it. We have to be responsible. There was somebody who got out of jail not too long ago and needed some assistance to get on their feet. And I offered Kroger cards, and they said, no, you can't give them Kroger cards because they'll trade those for drugs. So I don't think I know enough about the system. I go to people who do know enough about the system, and they have rules and systems in place to help. Is it a perfect system? No, it's far from it. Do we have enough beds in Charleston? Do we have enough food in Charleston? Like at those shelters? We don't. So we could do better, but we have to really understand what we're doing in order to help out.
I think it turns to just being a good steward, maybe. And that strikes me, it strikes a chord within my heart. Just being a good steward of what you have and knowing when you sow that seed, where's it going? You know, and that's part of our responsibility when we give, I do believe.
Right, but, I mean, I understand that, I'm not contesting it there at all. But how can we be responsible if we humbly in our heart give money or food or shoes or something else that costs money, so it's the same difference as he feeding the poor, but he's not literally feeding them, he's just giving money for it. So, say somebody is asking her for her coat, and out of her heart she says, here honey, you need it more than I do. Now, say that she takes that coat and goes to the transit mall and sells that coat for dope. Now, is that on her? Is that her fault?
No, I mean,
That's not at all.
the line is going to be drawn, somewhere.
You can't
But
manage that, that's.
No,
No,
that's
we
exactly
can't
what
manage
that's
it.
exactly what we're thinking,
Yeah.
or what you're saying. You're saying we have to be responsible for where the music, the money goes to. That's what he was asking. That's what he was asking. He said, is he responsible if he, out of his heart, gives the money to somebody and you said that the disciples say that we are.
yeah, I think we are, and I think if
I
somebody
don't
doesn't,
believe in that. I can't. I can't do it, man. I can't do it. Because it's the same difference, I mean, it's okay, but it's the same difference as what he's saying about feeding the poor and rolling the dice. Why? Because he's not physically feeding the poor, he's just giving out money.
I would like to contribute. I think what it has to do is when you give, you feel good about yourself.
Right.
And that feeling of doing good could be sinful. We're not supposed to necessarily feel good from giving, right? If we're feeling good from giving, it's not a feeling thing.
Right, you don't feel good, I mean,
It's about.
I feel like that's a contradiction.
You feel like what?
I feel like that's a contradiction.
well, so let me clarify something. Saint Ephraim,
If you feel good about giving something, that's a contradiction.
Saint Ephraim, the Syrian, talks about doing good things for Christ's sake as being different than doing good things for another reason. So when you're doing them for Christ's sake, you're doing them because God gave you a commandment and you're being obedient to it. When you're doing it for any other reason, and there could be a number of reasons, it all comes down to pride. And so there's a huge difference between doing things for God and doing things for yourself.
Is that not in between you and the Lord himself, though?
Yeah, but it's my job to teach you specifically. I'm not teaching the whole world. I'm teaching
Right,
you,
I
my
understand.
spiritual children, giving. You don't want to contribute to somebody's illness, right? You don't want to, like, let's say, forget about illness. Let's say a parent spoils their child, right? All they're doing is out of love they're giving to their child, but is that the best thing to do? No. So it's kind of the same way. If you're giving too much and not in a responsible way, you could be actually harming somebody rather than helping them. I mean, how would you feel, talk about feeling good or bad, how would you feel if you found out that the $20 you gave to a homeless person is how he OD'd and killed himself?
I would feel terrible, but I wouldn't put that on my heart because I knew what I did was what I felt the Lord.
But let me take it one step further, because they say, well, then he's responsible. But if he has an illness, which is what addiction is, then whose fault is it? Well, it's just nobody's fault. He just died.
Well, it's not my fault. It's not my fault at all. He asked me for. I believed him. I humbly believed him. So.
But what if?
I'm not going to be damned to hell because I gave somebody $20 and they went and they did.
I'm not saying you're going to be damned to hell, but what if someone else only gave him $5 and he only got high on $5 worth of stuff and didn't die?
What if he did that? then they would be responsible.
Well, yeah.
You know, I mean.
But do you want to be responsible for it? Because again, I'm not the priest for all of Charleston.
Well, if you're saying that we would be responsible, that means don't ever give $1.50 for the bus to anybody. Don't ever give anybody anything, because that's a sin.
But
That's what you're saying.
but a lot of the homeless people, what do they ask for?
It doesn't
They
matter.
don't ask for
Do
$5.
you know-
They say, "Can I just have 25 cents? I need to make a phone call."
But
Do
can
you
you
just
judge
have 50
that?
cents?
Can you judge what it's going to? We don't know.
You don't have to judge. You have to just
If you don't
be.
give it to all right.
So you could go home and say to yourself, you know what? Somebody asked me for 50 cents. I'm going to go give 50 cents, but I'm not going to give it in the way that they asked for it. I'm going to, maybe it's not going to be 50 cents. Maybe the next few 50 cents, I'm just going to write a check for $50 and you know.
And then what if they take that and go OD?
No, not to them. You're writing the check to somebody who's feeding the homeless.
Right, okay.
Yeah,
I
Fadi.
understand.
I guess it's about the wisdom. So it's not like God asked us to be wise as snakes actually. So if you know this person, you can not judging, but actually you have
You can read people,
you
yeah, I
can read
understand
people.
that.
You have wisdom.
I understand
Like if
that.
I see this person, let's say a drug addict or alcoholic or whatever, I'm not gonna give him money. But I can feed him if he's hungry.
Right.
But the thing is, if somebody asks her for a jacket, and let's say it was 9 p.m. and it's cold and give him the jacket, and next day when the sun out, they went and sold it, it's not her fault. So this is
That's
a
exactly what I'm
wisdom.
saying,
So you
yeah.
cannot just make a general scale on all or every single situation. You cannot say, hey, I'm not going to give him $1.50 for a bus. No, give him $1.50 for a bus. That's okay. But also, don't give him $1.50 if you know he's going somewhere to do a crime, for example.
Right.
So it's kind of wisdom.
I understand. But the only thing, I'm done. The question he asked was, what if he had gave that money to somebody without knowing that they were going to do something, and they did? Does it weigh on his heart? Is he responsible? And he said that the disciples said that, yes, sir, he was responsible. That is wrong. That is wrong. It's wrong to me.
He didn't say it like this. He said
It is.
if he did
I
it,
asked him twice. That's
if
what
he
he
did
said.
it and he know
I'm not
it's
fighting.
on
I'm just saying
purpose,
that's what he said.
on purpose,
All right.
maybe it's on fault. But
That's fine.
I mean,
That's fine.
Well, we'll pray about it. Let's talk about monasticism, should we?
Sorry to cause this argument.
It's a good
My
discussion.
question is ignite the powder keg.
It's not an argument, it's a debate.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
That's a semantics at that point of whether an argument is a debate.
Well, we can go as deep as you guys want.
Okay. Well, monasticism. So all Christians should try to live their best Christian life and practice some sort of asceticism. That's what we were talking about before we got off tangent. One form of Christian life that places asceticism above all else is monasticism. Monasticism is a road leading to perfection, because doesn't Christ say, "Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect," right? So monasticism is a road leading to perfection. We know that while we're on earth, we'll never become perfect. We're perfected through our ascetical labors. In fact, when a martyr dies, for example, they don't say he was killed by the sword. They say he was perfected by the sword. So he was made perfect by being killed with the sword. Christ did not impose monasticism as a commandment because it's too difficult for most people to bear. Monasticism is living the angelic life on earth. Since the angels don't have bodies, monks and nuns attempt to give up the needs of the body in order to focus only on their worship of God, just as the angels do. So when we sing a troparion for a monastic saint, we call him or her oftentimes an earthly angel, because they live the angelic life. And that's what monasticism is. It's the angelic life. Angels are the source of light to monastics, and monastics are a source of light to us. So we indirectly are receiving the light of the angels through the monastics. Monastics, kind of like priests do, wear black as a sign of repentance and death to this world. The monastery is where we can see the best form of Christianity practiced. So there are three main virtues in monasticism. They're poverty, obedience, and chastity. So we'll start with poverty. Christ says in Matthew 19:21, whoever must be perfect must sell all that they have and follow him. Monastics have a complete renunciation of the world, including their families. How many of you have seen that movie, The Island, or Ostrov? Have you ever seen it? It's really good. It used to be on Netflix. You can watch it for free online somewhere. But it's about a monk who really is like, he's like a classification of monastic, or somebody they call a fool for Christ. So like he doesn't care about what anyone thinks of him. He's completely like gives up everything for Christ. And you kind of see that throughout the movie. It's an excellent movie. We showed it here once with a fellowship.
What's it called again?
The Island.
Island?
Yeah, in Russian it's called Ostrov, and it's actually in Russian with English subtitles. But the abbot of the monastery at one point had like a new pair of boots that he really liked, and the monk took them and burned them. He said, I'm doing you a favor. And the abbot was going crazy, like, how'd you burn my nice new things? And then he thanked him afterwards. He said, you're right, I was attached to these things. So even the monastic who barely has anything, he was like attached to a pair of boots, right? How easy when we have nothing, we get attached to a little tiny thing. Sometimes I find myself attached to like a fallen piece of staple. I sit there playing with it and like it falls on the floor, I kind of get sad. It's so easy for us to get attached to things. But imagine if we have tons and tons of things, right? Why did people invent attics? To store stuff that we're never going to use again, but we don't want to throw away. So that's how attached we are to things. We won't even let go of things. I'm the first sinner of that. My wife's always yelling at me for not throwing things away. So monasticism, the monks renounce everything, including their families. In most monasteries, they allow them to see their families once or twice a year, not for the monastic sake, but for the family's sake, really. So giving up all things is the truest form of freedom. If you think about it, when you have a lot of things, you have a lot to lose, and you're enslaved to whatever it is you have to do to keep those things. So if you have a house, you have a car, you have all these things, what do you need to do to pay for that? A job, right? So you're enslaved to those things, even if you hate your job, or let's say worse, let's say your job wants you to do something immoral. And then you're like, well, I can't quit my job because I need it for these things. Whereas Christ would say, it'd be better to lose all those things rather than to lose your soul. So anyway, again, this is monasticism we're talking about, and not everyone's called to monasticism. A monastic puts complete trust in God that he will provide whatever he needs. So never worries about the needs of tomorrow. So that's on poverty. Obedience is the second of the three virtues. Christ said, I seek not to do my own will, but the will of the Father who sent me. John 5:30. So the Holy Fathers say obedience is the tomb of the will and the resurrection of humility. Obedience leads us to humility, and humility is the mother of all virtue. The opposite of obedience is our own will. The opposite of humility is pride, because our own will leads to pride. And pride is the mother of all sin. Any sin can be traced back to pride. Monastics are in complete obedience to their elder. Now remember, I said monastic obedience is different than like what it would be in a parish setting. So everything in the monastery, for the monk or the nun, everything, including how much they eat, how much they sleep, how much they pray, and how they eat, how they sleep, how they pray, etc., their whole life is determined by the abbot or abbess of the monastery, to the point that they are completely giving up their will. And that is a very blessed kind of obedience that not everyone can do, and it takes practice to get to that point without getting mad at the abbot or getting mad at whatever. But that kind of obedience is really beautiful to watch too, because they trust completely in the abbot or abbess as the representative of God. And there are checks and balances. The abbot has to, or abbess has to be obedient to the bishop, And then they themselves also have their own spiritual fathers. So it's not like they get to play God and do everything on their own. But for those monastics, they are the father or the mother, and the monastics are completely in obedience to them. And the final virtue was chastity. So absolute chastity cannot be practiced by all people. It's a special calling. It refuses sensual pleasure, which keeps us tied down to our bodily needs. Bodily chastity leads us to spiritual chastity and purity. One can only truly love God with all his heart and all his soul, as Christ says in Mark 12:30, through chastity. Because then you're really giving your whole might, your whole heart. Again, does that mean the people who don't do that are going to hell? No. But we're talking now about monasticism, a higher calling. Purity is a supernatural denial of human nature. Right? Weren't we created to procreate, created to eat, created to laugh and enjoy ourselves? So purity is the supernatural denial of those human nature things. So through the prayers of the monastics, for the whole world, they keep the world going. Why? Because man can only do so much. But through a monastic prayer, because they're praying nonstop, God intervenes and saves the world over and over and over again. And that's a bit about monasticism. Monasticism is not a topic that can be covered so easily. I just covered the main points that the author in our book covers. But there's so much depth to the monastic life. There's a tradition that is just really rich. There are slightly different traditions too. You read, like in the life of St. Mary of Egypt, you read about the kind of asceticism that St. Mary did, although she wasn't a monastic necessarily, but she lived like one. Then in that same story, you hear about the life of the priest, Father Zosimos, and the type of monasticism they practiced in that monastery. There is the kind of monasticisms that I talked about, like the very rare kind, like the hermits. We do have hermits living in the world today. The stylites, I don't know of any stylites in the world today, but who knows, maybe there are somewhere. But there are different kind of like levels. The monastery I grew up going to, St. Nectarios Monastery in New York, it's a very strict form of monasticism. They're a daughter monastery from Philotheo Monastery, which is on Mount Athos. Whereas here in Wayne County, the monks, although it's way more of an ascetical struggle than what we're doing, it's maybe not quite to the level that they're doing at St. Nectarios Monastery. And I've discussed that even with the monks over there, and they said, yeah, we're nowhere close to what they're doing. So there are different levels, and one of the things when you're looking for a monastery to join is where you think you could fit in. And sometimes there's a trial period that they're like, you don't really fit in here. Maybe try a different monastery. So it's not like you go to the monastery, you're automatically accepted. They have to accept you, and it has to be like a good fit. Any questions on monasticism?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So, Christ taught us to, be in the world but not of the world, which is definitely what the monastics do, and to preach the gospel to all nations. How then is a monastic preaching the gospel to all nations when they're cloistered in a monastery or in a desert? And I know we hear and we read the stories of these holy people and saints and elders, which I guess in a way is them disseminating their lives and examples. But how then does that follow that edict?
So when I need my spiritual battery charged, I go to the monastery, and I gain wisdom from the monastics, and then I take a lot of what they say out to the world. And that's their way of doing it. And the way their prayer works is that they're able to do more with their prayer than I'm able to do with my actions, because their prayer is so intense. And you have to have faith that their prayer works, or else it sounds like they're not doing anything. But I really believe that their prayer saves the world. And so by those two things, I think they preach the gospel to all nations. Especially I mean, there are thousands of pilgrims that go to any one monastery a year, and they're taking that message from the monastery and taking it out to the world. So I think that's really a beautiful thing. That's how they spread the gospel throughout the world. But they have to be in the monastery, and they have to stay there in order to be able to gain that spiritual peace that they have. Because if they went out and did the work in the world, then they'd be like me. They'd be going bald and gray and crazy. Because they have to have that like life of kind of simplicity and purity, so that they can give me what I get. And then I go there, I get rejuvenated spiritually, and then I can come out and share that message with the rest of the world. You don't look convinced with my answer.
I mean, I'm sort of also in the middle, like, feeding.
Yeah.
So,
But-
my attention is slightly divided.
Yeah, but how do I preach the gospel to the world? I've said in my sermons before, I'm your priest, and you guys are the priests to Charleston, right? So I'm part of the holy priesthood, you're part of the royal priesthood. And at your baptism was read the gospel to preach the gospel to all nations. So if I don't preach the gospel, does that mean I have to go to every single nation and preach the gospel? No. By preaching the gospel to you, maybe the gospel eventually will get to all nations one way or another. Maybe it'll take several generations for that to happen. But maybe I'm a missionary, and my preaching only goes to Kenya, but it doesn't go to Zimbabwe and Holland and Saudi Arabia. But does that mean I'm not preaching the gospel to all nations? I think in the same sense, the monastics, they have their people who they're preaching the gospel to. I think they do it probably better than anyone else because of their inspiration to the rest of the world.
It's probably something I'm going to have to take time to get on board with.
Yeah. Just pray about these things.
It's not even preaching with your mouth, it's preaching with your actions as well.
Yeah.
They just lay those actions into the world without even having to use their mouths. You know what I mean?
I recommend everyone should go spend some time in a monastery for like a weekend, for a couple days. You can't just go for a day trip because you miss the whole like feeling of the monastic life. You have to go spend a little time there, and it'll very quickly change your life. I mean, there's almost nothing equivalent that you can do outside of the monastery, outside of having a religious experience, where like God blinds you on the street and tells you to go get baptized or something like St. Paul. But other than that, I mean, monasticism, observing the monastic life and participating in it even for a couple days is really amazing. Any other questions? Yes.
When you said something I like about like when you're battery need to be recharged, you go to the monastery. I like that, and I used to do that a lot in Syria. But the things about obedient, it's kind of like I'm confused a little bit with the definition of that, because I believe like the monk or any person should give up everything and don't have a pride or whatever, all that. I agree with you. But the things about personality it's very important to me. Like, I cannot imagine somebody telling me how to eat, how to sleep. I know doing that for my salvation, but I see sometimes also extreme activities from some monks. Like you see like a monk like 60 years old, like he's bending and kissing hands of the veranda or the what they call it?
The abbot.
Yeah, the abbot. So I feel sometimes it's God create our personality to be free, to be strong, to be I feel if I wanna give up my personality, I'm hurting myself.
Yeah,
That's
they're
why
not
I
giving
cannot-
up their personality. Actually, if you go to a monastery, each monk has his own specific personality.
I know,
You see
I know.
that very clearly.
But sometimes you feel like they're so, especially the nuns more than the monks. Like when I go to their seder where you get your clothes from, I love them all. I really love them, and I spend the best time ever in my life with them. But like sometimes when you talk to her, Sometimes you ask her, you feel like she's 30 years old. I don't know, I have to ask learn this up. I feel like, kill me. I mean, you have to have your own opinion. You have to have your own personality. Don't worry about the wrong stuff.
Yeah, so in the monastery it doesn't work like that. And
Yeah, this not
you know, I had a hard time when I was a kid. I used to go to the monastery and they had like such strict obedience. And it used to bother me a little bit. I thought it was weird. The more like spiritually engaged I became, every time I went back, it made more and more sense to me. So our problems all come from when we do whatever we want, right? So by being taught to have that obedience, and how do they tell you what to eat and how much to eat? So everybody gets the same amount of food, right? Unless the abbot has specifically told you you need to eat less or you need to eat more. Sometimes they say, like if someone's sick, maybe they want to fast more, and the abbot says, no, you don't have a blessing to fast today. You have to eat more. They all eat. They sit down, and this isn't every monastery. These are some of the monasteries I'm familiar with. They have all the same food, and they have a cup. It's not filled with water yet. They're not, after the prayer, they start eating. They're not allowed to even drink water until they ring the bell. Why? It's not to make you go thirsty. They don't make you wait very long. But the point is that you wait for a blessing to do it. And at first, because we're so used to doing everything the way we want to, we can't even accept seeing other people do it. We can't even do it for one afternoon. We think to ourselves, my God, this is crazy. I can't even drink water when I want to. But the more you do it, the more you say, you know, it's kind of freeing. You don't worry about anything. And that's what it is, giving up the earthly cares. You give up the care even to eat and drink. You just do exactly what the abbot says, and you're going to be just fine. And you don't even have to think about it. To me, that's the most beautiful thing. That's really letting go of everything. And by the way, we have free will. Our free will, and the monastics' free will, is to give up their will to their abbot or abbess. That is their will. They have the free will. And they have the free will to leave, too.
You didn't get the point.
No, I did get the point.
No, you didn't get the point. I know all of that. The thing is, when it's come so critical, they used to it. So whenever you ask them anything, oh, I have to ask the Miranda or this or whatever. So I feel like that's take their personality away, you know?
Taking their opinion.
So it's so critical. I cannot explain it. I know them very well. I love them. And I know what their perspective, but for me as a fatty, I cannot be like them.
Yeah, and that's because you haven't tried. If you wanted to be like them, you could learn.
I cannot.
But you
I
don't
know
want to.
myself, I cannot. I mean, I cannot accept it to myself.
Okay. But so if you told me this in confession, I would tell you that that's something you have to work on. But since we're not in confession, I'm not going to tell you in front of all these people.
I mean, consider it as a sin. I don't, you know.
I mean, I don't have to consider anything.
I need to. If it's wrong, I have to work on it. But you know what? You get my point.
We have to have humility. Obedience breeds humility. And the monastics have perfected this. And if you read like the Ladder of Divine Ascent by St. John of the Ladder, have you ever read this book? This is like probably the most important book to read after the Bible. The Ladder of Divine Ascent.
I read some of it this year. In our
Yeah, it could be a little tough to read. I know you were trying to read it last Lent.
I'm not even out of the preface. It's a 120-page preface.
Yeah, but really, this kind of obedience brings the humility that we need to have the virtues. Without it, we're going to be really stuck. So if somebody's that stuck on it, it means they should probably do something to work on it, right? And that's really what obedience is about. It's not even that the abbot or abbess knows the best. It's that you give up your will to that person, and then your obedience will be blessed. Because
even if they're not totally spiritually correct to that situation.
Yeah, I mean, usually an abbot or an abbess, all of them almost, I'm sure there are maybe some not so good ones somewhere. All of them I've ever met are pretty good.
Nobody's perfect. So
nobody's perfect. So even if they make a mistake, your obedience to them will still be blessed because that's your job to be obedient. Then If they're making bad decisions, then it comes on them. And it's the same with me as a priest. If I tell you to do something here in the church, and you're obedient to it, even though it's maybe not the best business decision or whatever kind of decision, you were still obedient to the priest, and God will bless that. Dr. Mamalakis, when he was here, spoke about a church in Indiana that started off as a mission. They had an old, poor priest who probably didn't really know what he was doing. And he said that when he first went there right out of seminary, the guy drove him crazy. The priest did, because he was making like all these really dumb decisions, and like nothing was like right according to, you know, how it should be. But he said this tiny church that they were dying to have a priest, because they were dying to have the priest, they were obedient to him to the point where they would do whatever he said, even if it made no sense. And because of that, the church grew really fast in a way that was just, it was obviously blessed by God. And he said it took him years to do that, to understand that about this priest, is that because they were obedient to the priest, God blessed that. And he said that in response to a question about being obedient to the church leaders, the priests and the hierarchs. So just be obedient, and there's a huge blessing. There's great fruit that comes out of obedience. But unless we really believe in the power of God, that's not going to make sense to us. It's one of those mystical things. So that's why I say you have to practice it and see it for yourself. Any other questions? Okay. Monasticism is great. You have to go try it. Not try it to do it, but try it. Go live it for a couple days.